not abstract or anything like that. But I mean, we all know that composers and musicians have been inspired by historical things. Rembrandt painted a lot of historical pictures. And there's been something on my mind for a number of years, and I would like to try and paint something today from a Finnish composer who sketched a lot in nature, just as we do, and he did a symphony about swans. And if you listen to it, it sounds like a very nice symphony. But I went to a symposium and went to a lot of lectures about this particular composer, John Sibelius. And as it turned out, he started to compose this, and it ended up being the last movement of the piece. And when you listen to it, you don't really get the connection. But when you listen to someone who's studied the composers, like we study artists, and a lot of times in class, we're doing portrait work, and I may say to somebody, mix up that pile of green and put it in that model's face. And you wouldn't think that a mustard green would be the right complexion for someone's portrait. But then when you go to the museums and you study the masters, and you see that green, and then you start to understand a whole new concept of painting. And a lot of this is the same with classical music, and there's a correlation between the two that is very complete. They study their scales like we study our scales. They have a very dark piece, and we have a very dark painting. There's something very light, there's something very dramatic, there's a huge crescendo, and the correlation is quite amazing. And I think it helps make the painter a little bit more complete if we study other facets of the fine arts. So I have, where's Lauren? I have the end of the symphony, and I'll promise just to play a minute, or maybe 2 minutes. But you will see what he was thinking when he was out in the snow and watching and observing. And so when it starts, you can kind of hear the music, and it's a little dissonant. You hear the horns, but you can imagine the geese or the swans, they're cackling before they get ready to take off. Right? And then the first pair take off, and then as the symphony goes along, you'll hear the orchestra and the crescendo rise as the swans rise. Now, I would like to do that, a little of that, if I don't back out of it. All right, well, we'll just listen to a little of it. I hope it's right. So this is the beginning of it, right? The first pair start to take off. talked a lot about everything except painting. But in order to paint anything, I mean, we have to understand what we're doing. And for a long time, this is what I've always wanted to paint was something outside. But you have to, then the hardest thing is to find somebody who knows what they're doing. And it can take a lifetime, actually. And I was very fortunate that it didn't take me my whole life. And I was soon pushed outside and said, if you really want to discover painting, then you have to understand the elements about what we're doing. And in order to do that, Arthur said that it's the light of the sky that gives the earth its meaning. And you have to learn how to paint space. Okay, well, how do you paint space? How does paint? So it involves atmosphere, the weather, the different times of day. And before you know it, each time you go outside, you realize you're not going to get this soon. So this particular motif that I'm going to try is, I'm very fortunate. I live on a small lake, and I observe the swans. I've lived there for 34 years, and there's a pair there that swim by every summer with some of the little ones on the mother's back. They swim past my dock, and each summer you watch them get a little bigger, and then in the fall they start to take off. So it will be a fall picture very early in the morning, and I enjoy painting early in the morning. I think you can get a little bit more sense of dramatic light where there's more shadows. It's also just as dramatic at the end of the day. Being in the morning, though, one of the differences is that it's very cool from the night before, so you tend to get more moisture. We were outside this morning, and that heavy frost that you scraped off the windshield, but by the time you got there, you saw all that moisture on the ground. That's the difference than if we were to go back out and paint the same spot late in the day. So with that, I will start to paint the shadows soon, I promise. But to get that kind of control, the shadow control, and in understanding what illuminates the shadow outside, since the sun cannot get to the shadow, obviously, and we know that the sun is warm. So what is it that illuminates the shadow? And that's the blue sky. So there it is. That's the first thing that we learn. The shadow has the influence of the blue sky. So the shadow will have the influence of the blue sky, and it will also have the density of the air that we look through. So it will have that silvery gray of the atmosphere plus the blueness of the sky, and in this particular morning it's going to be a very cold, crisp fall morning. And until I get things going, I'll use this just as a control. And that's not to say that, well, the thing's going to stay in the end, it's going to stay blue and gray. It's just in the beginning that it helps unify that shadow so that you can pull out of it. So there'll be a hillside in the back here, and in the early morning, the long cast shadows are going to crawl up the hillside. And some of the leaves are going to be falling off the trees, some are going to be on. And one of the challenges of painting the fall scene is how do you go about painting all the different colors of the trees? And when you're standing outside and you see the effect is so fleeting. And one of the answers is that you start with just one simple average first. So in the shadow, we're starting with that, even though there's going to be some color in it. And there's a lot to study about reflections. Certainly in the beginning, we'll keep it as simple as possible. I'm glad the heat's on. I've toned the canvas to help me out a little. I think if we were painting outside and we had a white canvas, we'd have a very difficult time trying to capture this effect quickly. In fact, I know he wouldn't stand a chance. Maybe I'll have maybe some pine trees up there or something. In case you couldn't tell. But it's the same shadow control as for everything else for the time being. Just to put a little of the fall color in, just to get a start.
What did you use to tone the canvas?
It's a light gray, black and white with a little orange, and a little darker as it got down. As I was thinking of what to do, I wanted to keep the foreground in the shadows, so I made it just a little bit darker, so we wouldn't have to stay here till 5 o'clock. And also, things gain color as they come a little closer. So we'll use something a little bit more colorful in the shadow, in the front, right in the foreground. And it will help give us that space that I was talking about earlier. And, you know, just like the composer that we just heard, you know, a little while ago, he was actually trained as a violinist, and countless hours of practicing the scales, and it's the exact same thing. You just have to put in the time. It's not that we can't do it, it's the effort, the monumental effort. So the foreground, a little bit more colorful. It's still in the same shadow value.
Are you using any medium at this point?
I'm using some cold-pressed linseed oil, and I'm really just using it for this demonstration. I don't use much of it. But again, to try and get the effect down a little quicker, and it's a large size, it does make you go a little faster, but the danger in it is it gets too thin. So with the, you know, I've had a fair amount of experience, so I'm incorporating the tone with the paint as well.
What did you use to finish up the ground?
A little turpenoid. And it's applied like a stain. And it's been drying for about 6 months. And in our painting studies, we learn that in general, things that are upright are a little bit darker than things that are flat. Now, the one thing about reflections, unless there's any wind or a breeze, it's going to reflect pretty much like a mirror. If it's a shallow pond, you'll see through the water in the foreground, and you'll see some of the color of the bottom. The minute that breeze starts to blow through, the reflection is gone and you see the blue sky coming across. Some of the blue sky, I'll start now. Not that there isn't more shadow, but it's getting pretty dark.
Is that manganese and white?
A little bit. With the sun behind us, and this early in the morning, before this, as the sun's going to start hitting the hillside, there will still be remnants of a rosy glow in the sky.
Where's the sun coming from?
Over my head, in the back, coming this way. A little bit to the right. And it's an important question because you got to make sure you know that before you start. Sometimes you get so excited about painting outside and seeing something, before you know it, you forgot your direction. And it does happen. So we also have, I found out that there's just one dominant light, right? So in this particular painting, it's not going to be the sky as the main interest in the painting. It's going to be down into the landscape. Oh, well, no, not that I just found out. When I was studying, I found out rather quickly that you can only look at one place at one time. If you're going to look at the sky, then it's the sky that's probably going to have the highest light. It's in the landscape, and the sky supports the landscape. Now, to start some of the sunlight in, in such a large area, and since we decided that it was going to be in the fall, and if it's getting close to the peak of the season, we get a lot of color. You still have to start with something. And we said earlier that the sunlight is fairly warm. So if we start with something fairly warm as an average, and then we'll work into that. lot of sunlight for me. I don't know. Some of the trees certainly have fallen leaves. Sometimes at the top of the hill first. As you look into the woods, you get these shadows inside here. Couple. And also when the sun is on it, it's not directly on it, it's a little bit to the right. There's not a lot of shadow inside. So where there's, a little, I'm going to grab onto it. And sometimes the trees, you get a couple of them that stand out in front of the woods that are in the sunlight. You start getting an idea so you use everything that you can possibly imagine to help capture the effect. And this effect lasts just minutes. Because before you know it, you're mixing and the shadows start coming down, they start retreating, and before you know it, you're just left with totally, completely different effect than when you started. Just as beautiful, but different. Couple of red maples. Coughing sound like the symphony hall. I just saw last Friday at Lincoln Center Brahms's last symphony. And, it's a different. We'll stick to this one. All right, and then we talked about some pine trees. Actually, the pine trees offer kind of a nice relief against all the color. It was a blue and a gray. We talked about the shadows being illuminated by the sky, so it's blue. And then that gray is that penetrating atmosphere that we're always looking through. Now, as far as what darkness, that's the question. All right, how dark do you make something? All right, you've got an idea that that's some coolness of the blue sky, but you know that's where all this practice comes in. God. No end. Absolutely no end.
What blue did you use?
Cobalt blue. I knew you were going to get it out of me. Just wait.
Nice try, Dick.
When you're doing a study outside,
Yes.
and you paint quickly to capture that moment,
Yes.
do you use a linseed oil to make it go quicker?
Yes.
But when you paint not for a demonstration or not outside, you don't use any medium at all?
No, I do, not as much, because I usually, there's a big difference between studio composing and when you're outside studying. Studio painting may take longer to come up with the conception than it actually does in the exercise of painting it. That in the end of a lifetime of painting is where all the thought and profundity comes about. You know, in our early years, you know, I left the house when it was dark and I came home when it was dark. And you painted all day long, for years and over, wipe them off and throw the boxes in the closet and never going to paint again. You go through a lot. But as, 30-some years go on, you don't find yourself rushing out quite as much because you're thinking more. And that thought process, in the end, it's the conception of the painting that really tells the life story of the painter. So when you go to the museums, the more you go to the museum, the sooner you leave. You don't stay as long as you used to. Because a painter's last painting is really his last thoughts. And you and the more you paint, the more you realize what the other guys don't know. So you've seen a lot here what I don't know. And when you see, there's some that you go back to again and again and again, but not, you don't dwell on it. You say, geez, how do you do that again, right? And then you go out and you try and you figure it out. But for the most part, you're walking right by half the paintings. Some of the color into the shadow. Right, the thing, we're talking a little bit about reflections. The sunlight of objects generally reflect close to the same value, perhaps a little darker. And just like more or less we started in the hillside, it's in here as well that you start with an average first, then work into the specifics. Not to get into the technical aspects of painting today, but this thing that I'm doing now, that we call it halftone, and when you soften that shadow and that sunlight, you have the beginnings of that, what we call it, the first triad, and you start to have form. You have to, right from the start, before you even, and I went back to looking for somebody to study with. You have to have a point of view as to, what is it that you really want to paint. And when you decide that, and I think if, when we studied all those other painters and you're looking around and you realize that, what they were doing was, they were doing the best they could to recreate life on canvas. And if this is your outlook and this is what you want to do, then this is all that matters. And for the first lot of years, the subject becomes very, very secondary. I forgot about those swans. Right? Because this is a lot. It's a huge undertaking to understand what he was talking about, when he said that it's the light of the sky that gives the earth its meaning. That's your whole, that becomes your point of view. You try and keep your darkest accents in the foreground. By accents, we talk about the dark value that makes the rest of the painting retreat. sometimes there's an outcropping or a flat field up in the hill. Not that there was when I was there, but it just crossed over the it would help get some of that shadow we were talking about before into the trees. There's a stand of trees.
Do you use your on-the-spot paintings mostly as studies, or do you use them as finished products also?
Sometimes I finish them up, and I might hit it lucky once in a while. You don't think too much about composing outside like you do inside. But, you know, if things happen to fall in place, take it.
John, how many values are on that painting right now?
Good question, actually. I would say, you know, if you squint down tight enough, if you include the tone, which works kind of nice at the moment, at least 4. There's a lot of color in that sunlight, but if you squint down tight enough, it's pretty close to 1 value. And then the shadow, it's still fairly unified. Now I haven't put any yellow maple trees in the shadow to break it up, and I might not. Got enough, certainly enough going on. But there's dark accents in the upright and the flat plane. You know, that's easily 3 values. I don't know what's going on here.
Needs work.
A lot of work. But the question before, how many values on the painting? Now, in the end, you would like to try and get 5 in the shadow and 5 in the sunlight, and that always doesn't happen. I'd like to come up a couple of planes, or a couple of lighter values along the bank. You get some of the dried grass that time of year that kind of lights up when the sun first hits it. And you still have some of the field. Usually there's a fair amount of rain in the fall. We didn't have it this year, but some of that green grass is quite green in the fall. The sunlight on the flat plane.
When you say your first triad, are you referring to the triad on the color wheel?
Just
or
me.
huh?
Just This guy's still thinking about it. You seen Walk on the Water? Is it getting ready to go? We were talking about with the interruption of the reflection of the mountain, it picks up the blue sky. Not to gild the lily, but if there was a breeze blowing through, I wanted to put this to help to push the mountain back. I had in mind to put a tree in the shadow. Forgot. All right, all right. Gorgeous.
That's one of the toughest things. Thanks a lot. Thank you very much. Yeah, how to get all of that. There's so many colors then. You're so glad I saw that.
It's gorgeous out. It's gorgeous. This morning though it was 20 degrees. But
Well, I'd love to. Yeah. She'll be back in April. Yes. Yeah. I'll give you a call. Okay. Good. I'll definitely do it. Can I use this phone? Take a picture? Yeah, there should be a little thing on the side. Is it on? And then you push that thing. If I didn't get it, the picture.